Today we are going to discover everything about the Kremlin, the famous fortress of Moscow's Red Square, and the mysterious red stars that guard its towers. So roll the intro. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. It's important for us because that way YouTube recommends our videos and the channel grows more. Our usual deal: if you like this video, share it with at least one friend of yours who also likes military history. Deal? Let's go. The Kremlin is a fortress located in the center of Moscow. It is the seat of the Russian government and is probably the most famous tourist attraction in Russia. The term Kremlin means fortress within a city, and in fact there are dozens of Kremlins spread throughout Russia. So that Kremlin should actually be called the Moscow Kremlin, but to make things easier, we just call it the Kremlin. Well, its original construction was done by Prince Yuri Dolgoruki from the Rurik dynasty, who is now considered the founder of Moscow. He built a wooden wall, which ended up being destroyed by Mongol invaders in 1237, but then a new oak wall was built in 1339. This wall lasted until the year 1485, when the Grand Prince Ivan III, or Ivan the Great, hired several Italian architects to build new palaces and walls for the Kremlin. Among these architects was Pietro Antonio Solari, who was responsible for building the walls and their magnificent towers. Between 1485 and 1493, he built all the towers that provide internal access to the Kremlin, as well as several others that guard the walls. Solari's new walls enclosed an area of 275,000 square meters along their 2,235 meters of length. The wall reached from 5 up to 19 meters in height, and its thickness varied from 3.5 up to 6.5 meters. In total, the Kremlin has 20 towers, with 19 of them on the walls and one inside, the Ivan the Great Bell Tower. After the construction was completed, it was decreed that no other building could be built within a radius of 30 meters around the Kremlin. It was precisely in this space that Tsar Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, built the famous St. Basil's Cathedral in 1561. When Ivan the Terrible's son, Tsar Fyodor I, died without leaving any heirs in 1598, he ended the Rurik dynasty, which had controlled Russia for 800 years. Thus, the country fell into the so-called Time of Troubles, a period of various internal crises and a tremendous war against Poland, which saw the Polish invading Moscow and occupying the Kremlin for 2 years, from 1610 to 1612. Order was only restored after the expulsion of the Polish and the election of the young Mikhail Romanov as the new Tsar of Russia in 1613. This would be the beginning of the so-called Imperial period of Russia, during which the country's borders were greatly expanded, reaching approximately the size they have today. As a symbol of the consolidation of their power over Russia, the Romanovs had 4 large double-headed eagles forged in copper, their coat of arms to be placed on top of each of the 4 towers that provided access to the interior of the Kremlin. These towers, Spasskaya, Nikolskaya, Troitskaya, and Borovitskaya. In 1682, the young Tsar Pyotr I, later known as Peter the Great, had to flee the Kremlin in haste during the so-called Moscow uprising. He ended up seeking refuge on the Baltic Sea and built his new capital there, St. Petersburg. Because of the terrible memories from his youth, Pyotr never liked the Kremlin very much and ended up neglecting the fortress for the rest of his reign. St. Petersburg, or as it was called at the time, Petrograd, would remain the capital of the Russian Empire until the Revolution of 1917. However, all the coronations of the Tsars continued to be traditionally held inside the Kremlin. The fortress remained virtually abandoned until the year 1773, when Empress Katerina the Great commissioned a new luxurious palace inside it, which today is used as the seat of the Russian Senate. In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Russia and occupied Moscow in September. With the city practically abandoned, his troops occupied the Kremlin. At that time, the main entrance to the fortress was the Spasskaya Tower, that famous one with the clock that strikes 10 times, marking the start of the Victory Parade in Red Square, which takes place every year on May 9th. By the way, if you want to know more about Victory Day, click on this video right here. It was a tradition that everyone who entered through the Spasskaya Tower would make the sign of the cross, take off their hat, and get off their horse. An act of respect for the Tsar. Supposedly, Napoleon refused to do this, and as he passed through Spasskaya, his horse somehow got startled, reared up on its hind legs, and knocked his hat to the ground. Well, that was just the beginning of Bonaparte's bad luck, because a little over a month later, he had to abandon Moscow, which had been set on fire by troops loyal to Tsar Alexander I. Furious, Napoleon ordered the destruction of the Kremlin before they left the city. They managed to destroy several parts of the walls and towers. However, the rain, which kept falling nonstop, soaked the fuses, and the damage was much less than planned. After that, the Kremlin was completely restored from 1816 to 1819, and after that, little changed until the Communist Revolution of 1917. On March 15, 1917, the last Tsar of Russia, Nikolai II, was forced to abdicate, consolidating the so-called February Revolution. In his place, a provisional Republican government was established, which was still dominated by former Russian aristocrats. This government suffered several defeats on the World War I front, and its support base was quickly eroded. This paved the way for the October Revolution, which was a coup within a coup led by the communists Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, who then took complete control of the country from that point on. One of Lenin's first measures was to move the capital back to Moscow, to distance the new Soviet Union once and for all from the old Tsarist heritage of St. Petersburg. And that included reclaiming the Kremlin as the seat of government. Lenin chose the Senate Palace as his residence, and another guy from that photo I showed earlier, Joseph Stalin, who at that time was rising in importance within the party, also went to live there. And Lenin, as soon as he moved into the Kremlin, started complaining that those Romanov eagles on top of the towers had to be removed. But he faced more pressing issues then, such as assassinating the Russian royal family and winning the Russian Civil War. He only achieved this in October 1922, when he finally consolidated his power in the country. But by that time, his health was already very poor, and he ended up passing away less than a year and a half later, on January 21st, 1924. His successor, Joseph Stalin, ordered Lenin's body to be embalmed and a mausoleum to be built for him next to the Kremlin walls, between the Spasskaya and Nikolskaya towers. Also busy dealing with other problems, Stalin only addressed the issue of the Romanov eagles in 1935. That year, he decided to replace the old Tsarist symbols with the new Soviet communist symbols. That is, the five-pointed star and the hammer and sickle insignia. Symbolism is a very important aspect for any regime, and the communists took this very seriously. Let me explain. The star had 5 points because they symbolized the 5 continents that the communist revolution would eventually have to reach: Europe, Asia, Africa, America, and Oceania. The hammer symbolized the urban worker, while the sickle symbolized the rural worker. And by combining these two powers...
Water!
Heart! By your powers combined, I am Captain Planet! Go, Planet!
The problem started with how to get those eagles down from up there. No crane in the entire Soviet Union could reach that height. The Trotskaya Tower, the tallest of them, reaches 80 meters. So they had to invent cranes that could be assembled on the upper parts of the towers. Supports for a circular metal platform were installed in the upper windows, on which the crane arm was mounted, and it would raise or lower the symbols. Thus, the work of removing the eagles began, which took about 2 weeks to complete. Only after that could the stars be raised, but it couldn't be just any star, right? The project for the new symbols was handed over to the Central Institute of Hydroaerodynamics in Moscow. which resulted in 4 large stars made of copper and stainless steel, covered by a layer of 67.9 kilograms of gold. They were adorned with about 7,000 semi-precious stones mined in rural areas, including crystal, amethysts, alexandrites, topazes, and aquamarines, ranging from 20 to 200 carats. The work to set them was carried out by 250 jewelers in 45 days. The 4 stars also featured different designs. Nikolskaya's was the simplest of them, with smooth metal rays. Borovitskaya's was similar, but with an outline band around it. Spasskaya's was hollow, with rays extending from the center to the edges, and Trotskaya's featured rays in the shape of diamonds. Since each new star weighed about a ton, the towers had to undergo structural reinforcement. Otherwise, the wind might rip away the stars and tower tops. To mitigate this problem, the stars were mounted on a base with bearings that allowed them to rotate as the wind blew. That way, all of Moscow could periodically see the stars facing them. With everything ready, the new stars and the old eagles were displayed to the public at Gorky Park so that people could appreciate the change from the old to the new. On October 25, 1935, the first star was raised on the first tower. But the dream faded quickly. Within months, Moscow's harsh climate dulled the stones and metal, and now the stars appeared to be symbols of a decaying regime. People also didn't like the stars, complaining that they were too big for the size of the towers. Therefore, it was decided that they would be replaced only 2 years later. In May 1937, they were replaced with new ruby glass stars, this time without the hammer and sickle insignia, and all with a uniform design. They also decided that in addition to replacing the 4 stars, a 5th star would be installed on top of the Vodovzvodnaya Tower, which previously had a weather vane. That way there would be 5 five-pointed stars on 5 continents, you see? Metallurgy specialists from 20 factories were called in to work on the new stars project. They were built from a stainless steel alloy coated with gold, with a total of 11 kilograms of the precious metal used for the 5 stars. However, the most remarkable innovation was the introduction of ruby glass, and this was no ordinary glass. The red glass of the new stars had to withstand the weather, sudden temperature changes, and it couldn't fade or even suffer structural wear due to solar radiation. Creating this miraculous glass was the task of the master glassmaker Nikanor Kurochkin, who personally supervised the production of each piece. The stars would also be illuminated from the inside, and to allow for uniform lighting, Kurochkin created a layer of milky glass 2 millimeters thick, separated from the ruby by about 1.5 millimeters. The milky glass had 2 functions. The first was to make the lamps glow more diffuse, and the second was to act as a reflector of sunlight. Because without it, the ruby glass appeared black during the day. Special lamps of 3,700 watts were created for the Vodovzvodnaya and Nikolskaya towers, and 5,000 watts for the other 3, to ensure that the stars never went out. 2 parallel filaments ran into the interior of the star. If one went out, the other kept shining. And independent generators in each tower would ensure electricity even during a blackout. The light bulbs didn't need to be replaced from the outside. A special system was developed to retrieve the burnt-out bulb from inside the tower and replace it in about 30 minutes. To achieve uniform light inside the star, each bulb was surrounded by a refractor, which directed the brightness to each end of the piece. The lighting control of the stars was done remotely, because in addition to individual controls in each tower, a central control was set up in the Troitskaya Tower. Finally, a ventilation system to disperse dust and cool the bulbs was also installed. There were 2 fans, a main one and a secondary one, capable of pumping up to 600 cubic meters of air per hour inside the stars. The first ruby star was assembled in September 1937, and the next 4 followed in October. The star removed from the Spasskaya Tower was immediately installed at the Northern River Terminal in Moscow, which had been recently built. and it is still there to this day. Since the 5 towers were of different sizes, the new stars were designed to appear the same size when viewed from the ground. So the star on Vodovzvodnaya is 3 meters in diameter. The one on Borovitskaya is 3.2 meters, the one on Troitskaya is 3.5 meters, and the ones on Spasskaya and Nikolskaya are both 3.75 meters. The stars were lit for the first time on the night of November 2nd, 1937. And since then, their enigmatic glow over the Kremlin on the cold nights of Moscow symbolize the Soviet government's constant vigilance over the nation. During World War II, right after the beginning of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Kremlin buildings were all repainted to confuse German aviators during their bombing raids over the Russian capital. The stars were covered and turned off. They were only turned on once during the war, during the famous parade in Red Square on the night of November 7, 1941. The troops left directly for the front line to try to stop the Germans from taking Moscow. Right after the Soviet victory over Germany, Stalin ordered the stars to be turned on again, and they shone once more on May 10, 1945. With the end of the Soviet Union in December 1991, the red flag was lowered for the last time, but the red stars remained firmly on top of the towers. Other than during wartime, the stars were only turned off once more since 1937. That happened in 1998 during the production of the film The Barber of Siberia by the Oscar-winning director Nikita Mikhalkov. Since the 1990s, there have been discussions about replacing the stars with the double-headed eagles again. In 2010, during a maintenance procedure on the Spasskaya Tower, an official request was sent to the Russian government. That's when the Kremlin's military commander, General Sergei Klebnikov, made the following statement: "The star will remain in its place. We are considering the issue of replacing the lamp with a more cost-effective one in terms of energy savings. But when the scaffolding is removed from the tower, you won't see a double-headed eagle, but a star, washed, polished, and radiant. Apparently more than just a memory from the Soviet era. The stars now have an emotional connection with the people of Moscow, who have become accustomed to their glow above the Kremlin. And you, what do you think? Should the red stars be preserved, or should the Romanov eagle return to the top of the Kremlin towers? Want more Russian history videos? Comment below with your thoughts. But to complete the story of the red stars of the Kremlin, I can't leave out their role in the science fiction saga by the Russian author Dmitry Glukovsky. Metro 2033. I know many here have already played the series on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, but I really suggest that you read the books. The story begins with a global nuclear war that hits Moscow in 2013. Everything on the surface is destroyed, and only those people who manage to reach the city's metro system are saved. The Moscow Metro was built during the Cold War to also function as a bomb shelter if nuclear war occurred. 20 years later, the survivors have split into rival factions within the vast metro system, with Nazis, communists, and capitalists battling for control among small station groups. On the surface, radiation has mutated life forms, creating terrible predatory monsters. In this setting, young Artyom, the story's protagonist, lives. The plot also involves several supernatural elements which are not always fully explained, leaving the reader's mind to work frantically. At a certain point in the story, Artyom is preparing for his first expedition to the surface and talks with a young Danil in his quarters. "I'd like to know if you can see the Kremlin when you go up to the library," said Artyom to the empty space, believing that Danil was already almost asleep. "Of course you can. It's just that you shouldn't look there, because we're drawn to it," murmured Danil. "What do you mean by we're drawn to it?" Danil sat up, leaning on his elbows, and his face, now a picture of displeasure, was illuminated by the yellow candlelight. "The looters say you can't look at the Kremlin when you go up there, and especially at the stars on the towers. And that when someone looks there for too long, the Kremlin starts to draw them in. That's why the looters never go to the Great Library alone. If one of them happens to look at the Kremlin, the other has to distract him immediately. Artyom swallowed hard. "What's inside the Kremlin?" he asked. "No one knows because none of the people who went in ever came back out." Did you like it? I'm not going to say anything else, okay? Now it's up to you. So, did you enjoy this video? So follow us on Instagram, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell to get notifications when I post more videos. I'm going to wrap it up here. I really appreciate you watching, and here's a big hug from Solid to Guerra.